someone. Hey, Michael, how you doing? Chelsea, can you record it at your end also at the local level? Because I'm not sure
What?
how much space do we have on the cloud. Hi, Michael, how you doing?
Avinash, nice to see you. Hey, Doug.
How are you, sir?
All right, man. Good to see you.
Good. Likewise.
Yeah, we were about to just get started. So, perfect. So, hi guys, I'm Avinash Bansal, one of the co-founder at TomoClub, where we are developing a game-based social emotional learning curriculum designed for schools in the United States. Our discussion today centers around a highly pertinent topic. It's the impending expiration of SR funding, the shift in school leadership, and the upcoming 2024 elections. The objective is to provide school leaders with a holistic understanding of the forthcoming policy change and how these changes may impact the SEL policies. It's our distinct pleasure to welcome Doug Mesecar as an esteemed guest today at TomoClub Play and Learn series. And Doug brings a wealth of expertise on this topic. And looking at the crucial topic it is, I'm very excited to have this discussion. So introducing Doug, a seasoned educational technology leader with an extensive background in K-12. His journey began as a teacher in Jefferson County Public School and has been since held a lot of roles, including legislative assistant, director of education reform at U.S. House of Representatives, deputy chief of staff at U.S. Department of Education, leadership position at various educational companies, and his current role as a partner at Status Group. And currently, he's specializing in helping organizations and navigating the complex landscape of education and spanning policy, funding, strategic investments in federal, state, and local levels. So the list goes on. Thank you, Doug, so much for coming. And yeah, welcome.
No, my pleasure. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to dig into the topics. And yeah, there's one benefit from all the different things I've done in both the public and private sector. It gives me a fairly unique lens on what's happening and how to make sense of it. So I look forward to jumping in from there. I appreciate the introduction.
Yeah, we have some more guests joining in. Let me just allow them. Perfect. And yes, no, absolutely, Doug. But before we get started, I think you have an extensive career in education. I would like to know your experience and motivation behind it in the first place.
Ask me that question one more time. Sorry.
I said I would like to know your experience from your own words and the motivation that you have behind it.
It's a great question. So I actually studied political science, and I wrote my senior thesis on international arms sales. So I thought I was going in a totally different direction. But what happened is I got a job on Capitol Hill, and I worked for a member of Congress who served on the education committee. And the sort of, I don't know, secret, if you will, about education in Congress is not a lot of people actually want to work on education policy. Sad but true. That was different for a little period of time, but it's kind of true again. And so the member of Congress I work for said, hey, do my education work for me. And now my mom was a former teacher, and so I do have that in my background, but I started working on education policy at the federal level. I fell in love with all of it, and just the idea, right, that we could, change laws, change policies, put funding in place to really make a difference for students, across the country. And part of it is based on my story, which is, I used to give a lot of speeches at the U.S. Department of Education, and mostly because I got stuck with the ones nobody else wanted to do. So I had to come up with some way to make it interesting. So sometimes I would start off my speech and say, all right, who's heard of the Mescars from Michigan? Because I grew up in Michigan. Nobody's heard of my family or my last name, unlike Secretary DeVos and some of the big
Yeah.
names that come out of Michigan, right? And so I would say, how is it that I'm up here giving this speech that you're pretending to listen to? And the reason I was able to do that and give those speeches and have those roles is because I had an unbelievable educational experience. And somebody's dog is active.
Yeah.
And so many students in our country, not only do they not, and I had a strong family backing. My family was pushing me, supporting me in education, and I got a great educational experience. That's how I've been able to advance my career and make a difference. But so many students don't have a family to support them, or at least not as much. And they often don't get a very good education. And so what chances do they have? They still have a shot, but they're certainly starting with a lot of challenges ahead of them. And that's only become more true post-pandemic, and the challenges that I know you're focused on with, it's not just a great education in terms of academics, but it's the whole experience. Sometimes students spend more time in school, in classrooms, than they do at home. And we have to give them the best possible experience socially and emotionally, academically, and really help them turn into the potential that they have to do great things for themselves, their communities, and really the country. So, that's a little bit about how I got here and why I do what I do. And, it's a real pleasure for me to just know that every day I'm hopefully making a difference and improving the opportunities for kids, whether it's directly through policy and funding or working with great organizations like yours to get great solutions in front of kids, in front of teachers and leaders. So that's why I'm here. That's what it's all about.
No, thank you so much for sharing that. And no doubt, I can confirm that you are definitely making a difference in education in general. And for me, I think when I've been going out and talking to school leaders, the motivation part remains very sacred. You need to know why you're doing this. Otherwise, it's not a field that's going to reward you every day. And you need to have some internal craziness to keep on going on and still working for it. And now that brings up to the topic of discussion today. Um, there's a lot of conversation, but there's also limited real content around SR funding, particularly. Like, I'll give you first my observation as a startup, that I feel worried if some school come back to us and say that we want to use a program and want to buy it using SR funding. It always makes me feel that, okay, I'm not sure I'll be the first one to kick out the moment the fund dries up. And I'm I'm not that important for the school, and that scares the investors also community, that what you're building up is not something which is going to be kept on purchasing year on year. And so we actually discuss with the school leaders and say that what are the other funds which can be relevant to buy a TomoClub or buy any other program. So I would like to know your particular overview of SR funding and the significance in the context of K-12 education, especially around SEL initiatives and in general.
Absolutely, Avinash. And I get your points about it's a little bit of a mixed blessing in some regard. So let me start off with a couple of basics. So there were 3 separate ESSER funds, and we are now in the third and final sort of period of ESSER funds. So ESSER 1 and 2 are now done. Those funds have to have been under contract and then spent, right? And there's federal terms for that. I'm not going to get too wonky in the details. So we're in the third ESSER fund that came from the American Rescue Plan Act, ESSER 3, if you will. And it basically runs out. So you have to essentially have a plan, a contract in place for those funds by September 30th of next year. And then you get a little bit extra time to fully liquidate. Now, you can be spending or liquidating those funds now, but there's a little bit of flexibility on that. And this is by far the largest fund. So we're about 50% the way through spending down this fund. By my calculations, using U.S. Department of Education data, we still have around $60 billion that needs to be obligated and spent. And just to translate that, right, that's $5 billion a month between now and September of next year. Like, it's a lot of money, right? And that money has to go somewhere. And what's really interesting, Avinash, about these dollars is they're super flexible. So to address your concern, a lot of places, a lot of districts and states have used these dollars, frankly, as a down payment to sort of start something, see if it works. And what's unique about these dollars is that if it works, they can move to different sources of funding, other federal dollars, state and local dollars. That's generally not true when you talk about federal funding. If you start something with federal funding, you have to keep using federal funding. But these dollars are different because you could start them with the ESSER dollars and continue them on with other sources of funding. And then just to take a step back, like those sound like a lot of big numbers.
Yeah.
In truth, they're actually not that big when you think about the entire K-12 system. So annually, Avinash, K-12, federal, state, and local, all of those dollars combined, we spend almost $800 billion a year on K-12, just K-12 education. And so now, admittedly, 75-ish% plus or minus goes to staffing, right? So that's a huge number, but still, we're talking $160 to $200 billion a year that are being spent in K-12 education that are not staff related.
Yeah.
Okay. And so the other thing to keep in mind is that coming out of COVID, and now this is changing, right? But I would say, as a general rule of thumb, most states and most districts, the economies and the revenues have been decent, right? So the stimulus money hasn't been replacing lost dollars like happened back in 2008 and 2009 during the Great Recession.
Yeah.
These are generally dollars that are on top of state and local spending. So when the ESSER dollars run out, we're still talking about a lot of spending. And I will tell you this, and this is true. It has been true. I think it'll continue to be true. There's money to be spent, and budgets are about priorities. And so I would always make the argument, and always will make this argument, that if you can align your solution, what you offer, with the needs that have been identified by the leaders in the district, by the teachers, by the students, they will find money to continue working with you if it's having an impact in addressing the need that they have. So I sometimes think of ESSER, it is kind of like a little bit of a sugar high, right? In some respects, because it's this bump in spending. But what real good leaders are doing is thinking about, how can I use these ESSER dollars to maybe pay for things? For example, construction projects have been really funded by ESSER dollars. Well, guess what? At some level, all money is fungible. So if they're not using state and local money to do construction projects, that money is freed up to use it on potentially other things, right? Because they use ESSER money for that. So there's a little bit of that. The dollars can be moved around, not super easily, but they can be. And what was otherwise spent in a budget could be covered by the stimulus money, the ESSER dollars, and now something could be freed up elsewhere in the budget. And then last point I'll make real quick. So there's a famous saying, particularly in DC, never let a good crisis go to waste, right? It's a little crass, it's a little cold-hearted, but there's a lot of truth in it. When you want to make substantial change to a system, to the way people do things, well, there's no better time than when everything is kind of crashing down around you, right? And that was actually a famous quote from the 2008-9 recession. It still holds true now, Avinash. And so what I've seen state and district leaders do is look at their budgets and say, you know what? I'm spending money on some things that aren't being used. And if they're being used, they're not very effective, or our needs have changed. And why are we still spending our money on solutions or products or services that just aren't the same anymore, right? Because what we don't want to do is rebuild the exact same system we had before the pandemic, because for too many kids, too many communities, too many families. It didn't work very well. And so
Yeah.
you have a lot of leaders saying, you know what, we do have money. We have thought about our budget differently. We're going to use the stimulus money as a kind of a down payment or a way to take care of other needs and really focus our budget going forward on the needs that we really need. Like, oh, by the way, the mental health of our students, helping students to really engage with learning and, complement that academic focus with everything else, which I know you know so much about. So I'll stop there. I could keep going, but those are some thoughts in terms of the question you asked.
No, absolutely. I think I would love you to keep going, but I think I'll have much better questions that can add more perspective to it as well. But you're absolutely right. If I take an analogy from a startup point of view, that if we have extra money on the table, let's say through a VC fund round or something like that, our experimentation increases and we try to do multiple things. But at the end of the day, the things that really help the business operation sustains, even though that money dries up. So similarly, as a solution provider, you want to do something which is the primary focus of the school and not good to have. You want to do something which are must to have. So, and if you're doing that, the schools will anyhow figure out the way to pay for it, because you're right, this stimulus which is left is something like around 10 to 15% of the annual expenditure that they anyway do. So there's nothing to be really worried about the way it is being portrayed. And you just keep on doing the thing that is relevant for the school districts and focus on their motives. But what are the possible consequences that you can assume now can happen with several programs and resources that they have started? How are they going to prioritize uh, things because of this particular aspect drying up?
Well, it's a good question, and it really starts to, I think, get us into a couple of other areas that we wanted to talk about, Avinash, which is, so as we think about sort of what drives the funding or how is the funding going to be spent, you think about policy, and policies created by politicians, which leads us to politics. And so, one fact that I don't think a lot of people are aware of, but since 2022, so a year and a half ago, 50% of all of the state commissioners of education, so the top person, right, in every state who kind of oversees the state system, 50% of them have turned over. Now, some of it's a result of retirements, elections, somebody new comes in and wants somebody different. But that's a lot of change. And, nobody comes into the role saying, hey, I want to do what the last guy did. Everybody's got a new agenda. They've got new priorities. They're responding to the concerns and issues of the moment. And so that is both an opportunity, because you can, have a conversation with someone who's thinking differently because they're now new in that role. Sometimes, though, it could be a little bit of a challenge, because if you've got a good relationship with an existing chief state school officer is what they're called, and they leave, then you've got to build a new relationship with a new person. So a little bit of a double-edged sword. And then, of course, every even numbered year is an election year, one way or another. And this one coming up, is a big one. We've got the presidential election. We've got, a third of the Senate's up for election, the House of Representatives. And then at the state level, right, there's going to be a lot of turnover and change electorally, because most states, short of a couple, follow a very, almost the same pattern as the federal level. And so as you get new state legislators, maybe new governors, they're going to make changes and have policies. And so as we think about both the ending of the stimulus money, as well as some of these changes coming up, we're entering some pretty unprecedented times. Now, I will tell you, just as a side note, nothing big is going to happen at the federal level in terms of policy or funding. There's not going to be more ESSER money. I'm sorry to say, just want to be clear. They're not going to change the Every Student Succeeds Act or IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. So the major K-12 policy is going to stay the same. Now, a little bit of bad news is my sort of view on kind of normal federal appropriations like Title I, Title II, all of the regular sort of title programs, they're going to be pretty flat. We've seen some increases, not huge, but increases over the last few years. Those are going to kind of flatline. So there's not going to be a bunch of new money. The ESSER money is going to run out, but it'll be the same policy, which means all the action is going to be at the state level. And so as we think about, what are the new priorities going to be? Some of them are going to be the same priorities, right? Just because there's an election, it doesn't mean that students aren't struggling with their learning loss, with academics. They're struggling with chronic absenteeism, with engagement, with just being at school and doing school, right? And the mental health and social and emotional learning aspects. So I think there will be some perennials. We got to get kids back on track academically. We've got to address the mental health and SEL crisis that we've got. We've got huge teacher shortages, right? And that's a real issue as well. Like even the mental health of our teachers is a really important topic. So I think some of those will continue to be priorities. I think how we approach those might look a little bit different, but in terms of what are they going to be focused on? And then I think other things will shift and change a little bit, the increased use of technology. How do we take best advantage of that? And, there'll be some other things along the way. Assessment may change, and, there might be more project-based learning or competency-based education models, but there will be some consistency. So there will be change, which I think generally change is good, but it's also sort of, there's going to be some things that are going to carry forward, but the methods by which we, kind of go after and try to solve those problems, those may change as new people get into place.
No, absolutely. I would love to come back to this topic, why so many school leaders keep on changing every 2 to 3 years. But I have a last question about ESSER funding first.
Okay.
So like for me as a company, we identified going through multiple resources, what other funds schools can use to purchase TomoClub. And I could find 14 different funds for different school districts. And I used to have that resources very handy so that I can use that into my conversation. And I share it because it really helps them also, figure out their way. But can you recommend any resource which, which me or our viewers can use to identify those alternate funding sources?
Oh, it's a good question, other than asking you for what you've developed.
Yeah.
There are, different guides out there. I will say though, right, that you're probably, it depends on your level of knowledge. All of this information in one way, shape, or form is public information. You can find it, but knowing, for example, what's the most recent version of a law or a regulation or a guidance document, some sort of policy, it can be confusing at times, as well as just understanding how to read some of this government language, right? It's not always the easiest to understand. So I would say, if somebody feels pretty comfortable reading laws and regulations and guidance documents, there's probably a path forward to kind of roll up your sleeves and do it yourself. But there are other folks out there. I will just say, I do this frequently with clients who come to me at Strategos and say, hey, we're trying to understand what the funding environment looks like. So there are different groups out there. I'm not the only one by far. So sometimes you can find, someone to help you with that. But it's something that needs to be done, I would say, for everyone listening or everybody thinking about being in this space, because understanding where the dollars come from and what strings may be attached to those dollars, because sometimes so my point earlier about using federal dollars, if you use Title I dollars, which you could use, by the way, for TomoClub, you can't then start to switch to state and local dollars. So it kind of creates a little bit of you're boxed into a certain funding stream, right? Or for example, if you're in the career and technical education space, there's Perkins dollars, but you have to know kind of the details around what can those Perkins dollars be used for? How big is that funding pot? Is it even enough to purchase any sort of significant sort of usage of a given product or service. So the details matter, and the sort of requirements around some of those funding streams can get a little complicated. Again, there's a do-it-yourself, I think, answer to that question. And then I think there's also, folks who would be more than happy, of course, develop a relationship, and there's going to be some, exchange of fee for knowledge kind of situation. But there are people out there who can definitely be really helpful and help answer the question of, what are the different funding streams that I could potentially tap into?
Wow. And there was no strategic placement of that question, it may seem like. but but I'm glad that came up. But that brings me to another question, that it's been very early for me working in education space, yet I could see very frequent shift of the school leadership. And sometimes it does make me feel that, what's exactly going on? Is it like, because how do you develop those relationships? Because they keeps on changing around. So is there some story behind that you want to share, that why it is so fluctuating at the highest level?
Yeah. So it's sort of it depends on the situation. It's very stressful to be a district superintendent, a chief academic officer, in the sort of cabinet of a school district. And the same is true at the state level as well, right? So a chief state school officer and the leadership there, it's very stressful and hard. You have a lot of pressure. It's very public. And sometimes the rewards are few and far between, because everybody's criticizing you, everybody's looking at what you're doing, right? And even if you have some wins, you may not always get the kind of credit that you hope for. So from that perspective, I think it's taxing emotionally for leaders. I would also say, right, something I said before, this is a lowercase political. I don't mean it as a partisan political, but politicians are involved, whether you're in a predominantly Democratic state or predominantly Republican state. And so, for example, when a new governor comes in, they, as I was suggesting before, they have a new set of policies. And so they want to bring their team in who they know really are supportive of their policies. And so the people before were working on a different set of policies. And so now the new team comes in to implement the new policies. So there's some of that just natural churn as well. And then I think the supply problem, right? We're just not producing enough leaders to really take, the reins and really know that, this is a career path that they're ready for, right? It wears people out. It's a challenging role. And I think the world of people who not only do it, but stick with it and become great leaders. But you got to have really thick skin. And the other thing too is, the pay is not terrible by any stretch, but it's not like they're bringing home huge paychecks on a general for the roles that they have. And so I think there's some just natural attrition, because people think, hey, economically, to support my family or my grandkids or future generations, I need to make more than I can in this role. And so they start to think about other ways to earn money, because we do not, whether it's teachers, whether it's leaders, have I think a pay scale that really incents people to stick with it through all of the challenge, right? I mean, it's incredibly rewarding, right? As we talked about before, you've got to be in it intrinsically. But I think we'd also be silly to ignore the fact that economic considerations do wind up playing a role, just because that's a practical thing that you have to worry about. So I think there's a lot of reasons why there is turnover. But school boards in particular that oversee districts, they're subject to elections as well. So if a new school board comes in, they may want a new person in there. And those elections happen fairly frequently, every 2 or 4 years, which creates as well some turnover. So yeah, lots of reasons. I wish I had a great answer for how we start to solve that, but it really, there's more reasons why people leave. I think sometimes than feels comfortable.
No, I agree. it just feels a little mind-boggling in a way that just get started to understand things around, and there you go, you keep on switching around. And for anything to move, really, you need to have time before the people of the district will start listening to you. And but I agree with you that on the very fact that it has to be economically making sense, because being in public domain is not easy when literally every step of yours is going to be under the radar. And it's a hard pill to swallow for most of the people out there. And I just respect people who are still putting in the effort every day to make it work. And yeah, I want to understand now from a little bit, there's a little intrinsic motivation for me also to talk about social motion learning, of how it has become a topic of discussion across last 3 years or 4 years specifically. In fact, when I get started in SEL, it was a shitstorm everywhere. There were groups divided. Now it's getting better. People are not fixated on the term as much as they were, and they're understanding the value of it. But I want to understand from your perspective, especially as we approach 2024 elections, what are the key decisions or policy issues around SEL that you can forecast?
Yeah, it's a great question. And you rightly point out that, probably, hopefully, maybe we've crested the high water mark of kind of controversy around SEL, social and emotional learning. What it reminds me a lot of, Avinash, is if we go back a few years and talk about the Common Core, which was very controversial. A lot of states were like, "Hey, we're getting rid of the Common Core." They actually didn't. They just got rid of the name, right? And we're in a world where words matter, the specific words you use. And so they would say, "Oh, well, we're not Common Core," but they really just renamed it. They changed a few standards, but it's essentially the same thing. And some of that, I think, is going on around across the state. So sometimes you have to be, I think, right, a little bit flexible on, like, let's not get so caught up in a label or a particular phrase or word, but know that it's the same work. It just maybe use slightly different phraseology or slightly different verbiage. So I think there's some of that. I think, as what I've seen too is really a shift to sort of talking about mental health, and maybe not exactly the same as SEL, but there's resilience, there's grit, there's mental health. I think there's a lot of terms here, but I don't think that anybody argues with the idea that we really need to help our students mentally, emotionally, with behavior, which are all connected. I mean, the incidents of acting out disruptive behavior, fights, suspensions, expulsions, it's through the roof, right, after the pandemic, and not to mention chronic absenteeism. And so I think all of that is tied back to, how do we get students re-engaged in the right ways? How do we make sure that this feels relevant? How do we make sure that we're really addressing their needs and not just sort of using the same model of, well, we're going to kind of teach to the middle, and then we'll kind of help the kids who are falling behind, and we'll try to help the kids who are ready to go ahead. And like, that model does not resonate. And as well as, they don't understand, right, how a lot of students, how it connects to their lives. Like, why exactly do I need to learn this, and how does this connect to my interests? And not only that, but the issues that may be going on at home or in the community that really detract from the ability for them to engage and to learn and to grow and prosper. So I think there's a lot of recognition that that is an important piece of the puzzle. I think we still will probably fight over the particular words that are being used. But I see a wider acceptance of the idea than I do of particular words. But I'm not sure that that's necessarily a huge issue, as long as we're flexible in how we talk about it, but inflexible in what we're trying to achieve, meaning we're not really changing anything we do and what we're trying to accomplish. We're just kind of working with the language that they're more comfortable with to achieve those same ends. So I think it does require that sort of ability to kind of not be stuck on a concept so hard that you wind up losing the opportunity to help. And really with the elections coming up, again, I feel like this is kind of starting to settle down. But I will tell you, right? Like if you're trying to work in Florida as well as in California, you're going to also have to be flexible on kind of how much, what you talk about, because every state to a certain degree on this is going to be different. Now you can draw some parallels between blue states and red states are more similar to each other than not. Meaning more blue states are similar to each other, more red states. But it sort of also depends on what impact you want to have. If you want to work across all states, it's going to require you to have a little bit more of a flexible approach to how you talk about it. But if you really want to just hone in on one aspect of it, it may limit your ability to work with a greater number of students, teachers, districts, states, right? So there are consequences in the market and understanding kind of how you approach it. It may open up more opportunities, or if you make a decision to be like, hey, you know what, we're sticking with this phrase or this particular way of talking about it, and we don't really care if that means some people aren't going to like it, just make that choice sort of, don't let it happen to you. If you're going to make that choice, make it very deliberately, and just know that, some people you're just not going to be able to change their minds. But I don't think it's ever going to fully go away, because we live in a political world where controversy and conflict are sort of, I think, emphasized sometimes more than it really needs to be. Editorial comment. So I don't think it's ever going to fully go away, but I do think it's starting to feel like it's dying down a little bit, and I don't see that changing dramatically.
Yeah, I agree with you. I'll tell you a story. So when we started TomoClub, my motivation was always about the skills that will help you succeed in life. And with the advent of AI, you're not even sure what job profile will gonna look like when you're gonna go out of school and enter the job market. But what will really be evergreen will be the skills of how you collaborate, how you empathetically understand someone's perspective, and able to be aware about it and expressive about it. At the same time, leadership, innovation. So I was coming from that because I've done several companies before. And what I understand is when I started talking about it, I called that 21st century skills, or I was calling it future ready skills, or I was calling it skills. I think the problem was with these words, they're just too broad. And no school specifically was able to create budget for it, because there was no budget line item for that particular topic, right? And those topics cover everything and anything from cooking, coding, to fishing, to camping, everything, right? So that's how I drew my allegiance to this term, because it was just easy for school leaders to spend money on this particular sector. And of course, I at the same time understand the public divide on this topic as well, because there were some discussions around sex education or gender definition or critical race theory, which, to be honest, was not even my first motivation to start TomoClub. I'm anyways have a massive problem to solve for classroom engagement. You brought up equity. That was a big problem I want to solve using games, because it creates a level playing field. I wanted to solve the ability to speak up for the students in a safe space. So literally it didn't strike me while building up that, okay, what am I going and entering into? But at the same time, I've been working with some schools in Austin, in Florida as well. And again, they ask me that, are you very particular about this term? I'm like, absolutely not. I'm more interested to teach students these skills using games, and you can call it the way you would like to. But at the end of the day, it's like holding your ears like this or like that. It doesn't really matter. And thankfully, even in those states, you have to, though even those terms are getting more mellowed down. And agreed, I have a similar perspective that these problem statements are perennial. Hopefully, they're not perennial, but right now they look long-term problems, and it won't go away with the leadership change or the funding change, anyways. But But yeah, but what would you recommend for schools to ensure the continuity and effectiveness of this program, of their programs, whatever they're continuing? Um, Sometime policy might change, sometime governor might change. If any school leader is listening to our discussion, what do you think they should do to ensure the continuity of that?
Well, maybe you should answer that question. I mean, you sort of touched on one piece. I'll kind of be quick about this.
Yeah.
What is continuity, right? Some have talked about schools and districts and even states don't suffer from too little change. They suffer from too much. Like we talked about the leadership changes. If you're changing strategies every 2, even 3 years, doesn't give anything enough time to really settle in and make a difference. I mean, it does take time, right? As things get up to speed. And I know that's a hard message because you want to see the change now.
Yeah.
But I think the other part of that is what is the ultimate outcome you're trying to achieve? Because a lot of times, the ends are kind of nebulous. They're not well defined. And then how do you map like the progress and the outcomes that lead you toward that end state? And then frankly, you have to hold people rigorously accountable for achieving that, right? And that's something, all those steps, if you don't have all of that, if you just have bits and pieces here and there, you may not be successful, right? And so I think that's critically important. And you also, I think, have to focus on a discrete set of strategies to really make a difference. I not only is there too much change, but I think we often try to do so many different things all at the same time out of good intentions that they can get in the way of each other, or none of them are fully implemented. And we don't see the results that we want to get. And then, I'll just circle back to sort of understanding what you're trying to achieve. Data, understanding your data, understanding what problem. So for example, in a previous role, I'll leave names out. We would occasionally, when I was working for a company, get a call from a superintendent and be like, oh, we bought your solution and it's not working. And we would look at the data and go, well, let's look at this. So first of all, a third of the teachers haven't even used the given solution. So that would be a problem, a place to start. A third of them have logged in or used it sporadically. It's not on model, so fidelity of implementation. And then the other third who are actually using it and using it on model, we're seeing some good results. So how do we fix, the groups of teachers or classrooms or schools that just weren't either using it or not using it quite right? And then last but not least, and this is something that I'm sure you're probably working on, I see a lot more focus on, okay, do we have evidence that this is going to be a solution? So is it backed by research? And then do we do research studies to actually show like, hey, we got the outcomes we thought we were going to get? So that evidence-based policy is kind of the buzzword. But I do think it's an important piece to say before we sort of really invest in something, do we know that this is going to work for our given demographics, our unique problem? Can they show us the research it's built on? And then let's go measure and make sure that it's producing the results we want. So there's a lot in there, more than I thought I was going to say, but I'd love to hear your thoughts because you're working with leaders in schools and districts every day.
No, absolutely. You are right on the fact that evidence-backed research really ease down the pressure on the school leaders before choosing a program. But it's a chicken egg problem for young startups because it takes time before you can publish the results. So as a company, we are really, I would say, thankful to those early adopters who take up like our program for certain grades to start with for one academic year before they can implement it school-wide. And it does provide us, because then they're deciding anecdotally whether they want to do it for the entire school without even evidence. So hopefully in the next, by the next academic year, we'll be able to publish our results. We had early traces, but yeah, the pilots, or I would say phase 1 contracts to certain grades is a way that you talk to school leaders about it. And yeah, my overall experience with them has been good. That And it takes us back to the first point that we discussed, that if they really find the value in it, they'll figure out the funds, the implementation, and everything else.
Mhm.
And yeah, this brings me to the last question that I would love to take up some questions from the audience as well. How do you see the technology piece being talked about in the school decision making or the policy in general, whether it is the new stack of technology with AI or with game-based learning in general? How do you see the school leaders' perspective changing on that?
Oh man, we got to wrap this up. I could go on this one for a long time. So it was a little bit, I think, inevitable that I feel like there's a little bit of a backlash toward technology in some regard. A lot of it was incorporated and used kind of an emergency triage basis as we got through the pandemic and even after. And I think you're starting to see some pullback on, okay, what are we using the technology for? Is it being used? Is it effective? Do we understand the efficacy? So I think the other part of it, right, is you're also having a teaching workforce that is shrinking. Is probably in some regard less experienced because there's more substitutes or more teachers being pressed into service who, may not have, they may be just coming in off the street in some cases, right? So I don't think technology is going away. I do think that there's some consolidation, as I was talking about before, around we've got too many tools, we don't know what's being used or what's effective. And so I think there's going to be an increasing sort of, particularly, again, I know the ESSER dollars are not the biggest chunk, but the pie is shrinking a little bit. So there's going to be fewer dollars to go around. The needs are as great as they ever were. So just, are we getting, the sort of, is the investment we're making producing the kind of results we want? And I think technology for technology's sake is a concept that's long gone, right? I think the purchasers are much more sophisticated and better understanding of what they need, and are able to better, I think, in some cases, sort through the marketplace and identify solutions that really fit, and not sort of be swayed by, well, somebody else is using this, or that was pretty slick marketing. That sounds great. Let's try it. I think some of that is going away, frankly. And I think there will continue to be pressure on ed tech to show how it is evidence-based or can produce evidence. And I think the alignment, as we were talking about before, of is this solving a need, and can you show that it's solving that need? Will that kind of pressure will be as high as it's ever been as we go forward. But no one's going to pitch their laptops or their one-to-one initiatives. It's more a question of how do we use it better, and how do we incorporate that, because it's still all about relationships. And the technology can enable relationships, it can't replace them. And I think that mentality is as front and center as it ever has been as we sort of look at the next few years. And then to your point, everyone's trying to figure out how to cope with AI, and I don't think anybody has a good answer, but they know they have to deal with it. But I'm not sure anybody knows how to. So I think there's really an opportunity for some thought leadership about what does this particular technology look like? How can it be used effectively? But I don't think it's one we should be afraid of. I think it's one that we have to figure out how to leverage and take advantage of it. I mean, technology is a tool after all, and people are afraid that it's just going to completely ruin, the educational system. And I think if you don't figure out how to use it effectively, it can become a real disruptive force in a bad way, not in a, positive disruption. So we'll see. I think we're in for a lot of change. And who could have guessed 6 months ago we would be talking this much about AI or ML or LMMs or LM? Yeah, that's right, isn't it? Did I get LLMs? Yeah.
I agree with you. In fact, I was talking to an educator, and she said we had a similar experience back then when Google became so common. We used to think that's a cheat code. Now everybody know the answer for everything,
Yeah.
and now everybody's saying at least you have to research few articles. Now the answer is right in your just 5 seconds away. But I think the type of questions, because back then when I was in schools, the assignments started becoming more contextual, which you can't Google, honestly. And how those things gonna change with Chat GPT and other stuff, it's gonna be interesting to see. And that's why the live angle will become more relevant. The real time discussion based, whether it is math, science, core subjects, or whether it's SEL, my belief is the real time live thing will become more relevant for the schools, because otherwise anything done asynchronously will never be known whether it's done by the student themselves or it's done by an AI.
That's a great point. Yeah.
And that's my understanding of it. And yeah, you're right on the fact that technology cannot be just a piece of thing they can be fancy about. It has to show its results, and that's why edtech has been struggling a lot, because my belief is the first set of advancement that happened was around access, whether it was infrastructure wise in terms of a one-to-one device, Wi-Fi infrastructure in the schools, or the online availability of educators or content like YouTube. It was, I believe, was the first wave of access. The next wave of in edtech will be about engagement, that who will be able to actually make sure the students are completing the curriculum or completing the learning aspect in a engaged manner. So the engagement will be the one who will win in the second phase. It was Khan Academy of the World, YouTube, Coursera, Udemy in the first era, and hopefully TomoClub company like that in the second one. But perfect. Thank you so much, Doug. I think it was insane amount of discussion we did today. And if anyone in the participants wants to ask something, go ahead. We can have a quick 5 minutes Q&A.
Hey, Doug, it's Mike.
Oh, hi, Mike.
Hey, so I'm just curious. Thanks for all the information about ESSER. And essentially the takeaway is don't panic, right? The right schools will still be in operation. They're not going to go away. Maybe they found some new habits that they want to enhance, right? But sort of on a state by state level, do you see any trends or sort of states that have used their funding better, or perhaps may have gotten themselves into become more dependent on it, or any insight, thinking about how you might strategize state by state?
Such a good question, Mike. I don't have, I'm not going to call out anybody specific, partly because I think some of the story is yet to be written. We just don't know. And I think some of the early results haven't been extremely positive. You've probably seen some of the, different research groups, different groups out there sort of looking at the data and saying, wow, we really haven't moved the needle very much. And so I don't know that we know yet, because the data is still coming in. It is a lagging indicator, right? And so some of those leading indicators, I think, are either unknown or too early to really point in a certain direction. So I think part of this is an unknown. I mean, one of the things, Mike, that really worry me, well, and the other thing I'll say is, it's also can be really hard to figure out exactly how the money was spent. There's a little bit of a lack of transparency at this point, which can be frustrating. But where we do know they're spending money, one of the concerns I have, frankly, is, and this happened during the Great Recession, was a lot of people and sort of the desperation to either keep teachers in schools or just to get anybody in there have used one-time dollars for recurring costs. And I do think, when you look at the major categories of spending, that continues to be at or near the top, is the ESSER dollars were used on human capital. And if you didn't think about that strategically, you could wind up in a really difficult spot in terms of how do you make up for those dollars going forward, because state legislatures are not necessarily going to backfill that just because you used ESSER dollars to pay for salaries, for example. So I do think some of that is going to be challenging. I would say, Mike, this is not necessarily ESSER specific, but we've seen a huge sort of wave of states embracing the science of reading and the evidence and the research behind that. And a lot of states are putting ESSER dollars behind their science of reading implementation. So I think that's a pretty promising practice. I think it's 32 states have policies in place around the science of reading. And then I think you're going to start to see some states are looking at the science of numeracy, for example, the science of math. And I think that'll be the next wave coming. But frankly, academic intervention, a lot of states leverage tutoring. To be frank, I don't think a lot of those experiments worked. I think you're seeing a lot of states moving away from their initial experiments around tutoring, around academic intervention, and are rethinking how do we approach this. And I think you're also seeing, Mike, a growth in sort of the competency-based, personalized learning, project-based learning, because that teach to the middle kind of wait to fail model it didn't work before, and it's certainly not going to work now where the needs are even greater. I think you're seeing greater investment as well into sort of data collection, data analysis. So I think that is only going to increase. And then, the SEL story continues to be, right at the very top when we look at priorities going forward. So the investments that were started with ESSER dollars around SEL, I think will absolutely continue, whatever they're called, right? Avinash, mental health, resiliency, whatever it is. I don't know that we have a clear leader on sort of who's spending the money most wisely or most effectively. Avinash, I'd be curious if you have any insight into that. But Mike, I know it's a little bit unsatisfactory, but I think this story is still being told, and we don't yet have enough information to know what's really been effective. I do think we've seen a bunch of data that shows what hasn't been effective, and so it's more a tale of what hasn't worked, unfortunately, than what has worked. But Avinash, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
No, I think you did cover up a lot, and it's kind of a subjective answer as well, depending on where you are looking at it. Like my day in day out, I'm looking about SEL, so I have much more understanding about that. But that's all I can say right now.
Yeah. And on that, Avinash, I think we should probably wrap it up.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you guys for joining. Thank you, Doug, for taking out time. I'll share the recorded video to you as well. And it was fun conversation.
Thank you for having me. It was great. And Mike, great to hear from you. And Avinash, thank you so much for having me. It was a real pleasure to talk with you about these incredibly important issues.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Have a good day.
All right. Bye.